5 women went up Broken Ridge. 5 women came down crying before Sunday. Stephen Boone was a savage, a mountain of a man who broke mail-order brides for sport. The town took bets on the 6th. She was 300 pounds of desperate, and she wasn't going anywhere. Blackwood Creek, Montana Territory, was not a place for the faint of heart, and it certainly was not a place for fairy tales. It was a rugged, mud-soaked logging town sitting in the shadow of the Bitterroot Mountains, where men smelled of pine sap, cheap whiskey, and unwashed wool. In the summer of 1882, the town's primary source of entertainment was not the saloon, nor the traveling medicine shows. It was the matrimonial disasters of Stephen Boone. Stephen Boone was a solitary fur trapper who lived 5 miles up a nearly vertical trail on Broken Ridge. He stood 6'4", with a thick beard black as river mud, and eyes the color of chipped flint. He had survived a mauling by a grizzly, a Dakota blizzard that claimed 2 of his toes, and a cholera outbreak. What he seemingly could not survive was a woman. Tired of mending his own shirts and eating charred venison, Stephen had paid the Matrimonial Union Agency in Chicago a handsome sum of $50 to send him a wife. He specifically requested a sturdy, quiet woman who could haul water and butcher a hog. The agency, however, kept sending him delicate city girls, fleeing scandals, or seeking romantic Western adventures. None of them lasted a week. Bride 1, Mary Ann, fled on day 2 after Stephen shot a timber wolf from the front porch while she was hanging laundry. Bride 2, Abigail, packed her bags on day 4 when she realized Stephen expected her to chop her own firewood in sub-zero temperatures while he was out checking trap lines. Bride 3, Eleanor, lasted exactly 6 hours. She took one look at the outhouse, burst into tears, and walked the 5 miles back to town in the dark. Brides 4 and 5, left together after Stephen refused to speak a single word to either of them for 3 consecutive days, communicating only through grunts and pointing. By the time the stagecoach rolled into Blackwood Creek on a sweltering Tuesday in August, Elias Harper, the owner of the general store, had a chalkboard hung behind his counter. Men were laying down silver dollars, betting on the exact hour the new bride would inevitably surrender. When the coach door opened, the jeers and whispers died in the throats of the townsfolk. Carmen Higgins did not step lightly from the carriage. She lowered herself with heavy, deliberate effort. Carmen weighed over 300 pounds. She was a massive woman in a faded, sweat-stained gingham dress that strained at the seams. Her face was flushed crimson from the suffocating heat of the coach, and her thick, dark hair was plastered to her forehead. She carried a single, battered carpet bag. She possessed no parasol, no delicate lace gloves, and no illusions. The silence on the dusty street was deafening. Preacher Thomas Miller stepped out of the apothecary, his jaw slack. The men lounging on the boardwalk stared openly. They had expected another fragile flower for Stephen to crush. Instead, the agency had sent a boulder. Carmen ignored the staring eyes. She wiped her brow with the back of a thick forearm and looked up at the towering, jagged peaks of Broken Ridge. Her chest heaved, but her jaw was set like iron. Back in Chicago, Carmen had been a seamstress in a suffocating textile mill. For 10 years, she endured the cruel mockery of her foreman and the sneers of the other girls because of her weight. When the mill caught fire and burned to the ground, Carmen was left with nothing but the clothes on her back and $72 hidden in a tin can. She had no family, no prospects, and in the bustling, superficial streets of the city, nobody wanted to hire a woman of her size. Starvation was a very real, very imminent shadow. The mail-order bride advertisement was a gamble of desperation. It was a roof, food, and survival. She walked toward Elias Harper's store, the floorboards groaning under her boots. "Excuse me," Carmen said, her voice unexpectedly deep and resonant. "I am looking for a Mr. Stephen Boone." Elias blinked, looking from the heavy woman to the chalkboard behind him, and then out the window. "You're the new bride?" "I am Carmen Higgins," she stated firmly, "and I have a contract." Before Elias could answer, the saloon doors across the street swung open. Stephen Boone stepped out. The crowd parted instinctively. Stephen wore buckskin trousers and a heavy wool shirt despite the heat. He strode across the mud-rutted street, his heavy boots making no sound. He stopped 10 feet from Carmen, his cold eyes raking over her large frame. Disgust washed over his rough features. He spat a stream of dark tobacco juice into the dirt near her boots. "Agency is playing a fool's game," Stephen rumbled, his voice like grinding stones. "I asked for a worker, not a winter ham. Get back on the coach." A few men on the boardwalk snickered. Carmen felt the familiar hot sting of humiliation prick her eyes, but she swallowed it down. She had been called worse by better men. She tightened her grip on her carpetbag until her knuckles turned white. "I paid my half of the agency fee, Mr. Boone," Carmen said, her voice ringing clear across the silent street. "You signed a legal document. I have nowhere else to go, and I am not getting back on that coach. Lead the way to the cabin." Stephen stared at her. The flint in his eyes hardened. He didn't argue. He simply turned his back on her, walked over to a single, scrawny mule tied to the hitching post, and untied it. He didn't offer her a hand. He didn't offer her a ride. "Hope you like walking, Chicago," he muttered over his shoulder. "It's 5 miles up, and the bear traps are set." The journey up Broken Ridge was a calculated act of cruelty. Stephen set a brutal pace. He led the mule, which carried only a sack of flour, a tin of coffee, and a box of rifle cartridges. He did not look back. He expected the steep incline, the thin mountain air, and the punishing August sun to do his dirty work. He calculated she would last a mile, maybe 2, before collapsing in tears and begging to return to the valley. For Carmen, the climb was a physical purgatory. Within the first half-mile, the soles of her worn city boots began to blister her feet. By mile 2, the corset she wore under her gingham dress felt like a cage of iron spikes compressing her lungs. Sweat poured down her face, stinging her eyes and soaking her heavy clothes until they clung to her like a second skin. Her legs trembled violently under her immense weight with every step up the rocky, uneven trail. But Carmen did not stop. Every time Stephen paused to let the mule drink from a mountain stream, he would cast a sideways glance down the trail, expecting to see an empty path. Instead, he would see Carmen, sometimes crawling on her hands and knees over fallen pine trunks, but always moving forward. Her face was purple with exertion, her breathing a ragged, terrifying wheeze that echoed off the canyon walls. "If I stop, I die," Carmen told herself, over and over, chanting it in her mind as her vision swam with dark spots. "If I go back, I starve. I will not let this man break me." Around the 4th mile, the trail narrowed into a steep switchback covered in loose shale. Carmen slipped. She fell hard, her knee slamming into a jagged rock. The fabric of her dress tore, and a line of dark blood instantly welled up, trailing down her shin. She let out a sharp cry of pain. Up ahead, Stephen stopped. He turned and looked down at her, sitting in the dirt, bleeding and panting. He didn't walk down to help her. He simply stood there, a towering silhouette against the dying sun, waiting for the surrender. Carmen looked at him. She saw the absolute lack of pity in his eyes. It was a test. With a gritted, primal groan, she rolled over, planted her bloody hands in the dirt, and pushed her massive frame back to her feet. She didn't brush the dirt from her dress. She locked eyes with him, lifted her chin, and took a step forward. Stephen's jaw twitched. Without a word, he turned back around and resumed walking. By the time they reached the clearing at the top of Broken Ridge, the sun had dipped below the peaks, casting the mountain in freezing, purple twilight. The cabin was not a home. It was a lair. It was built of rough-hewn logs, surrounded by a fence adorned with bleached deer skulls. The roof was patched with sod, and the chimney leaned precariously to the left. Stephen pushed the heavy wooden door open and walked inside, striking a match to light a grease lamp. Carmen stepped over the threshold, her legs feeling like hollow reeds, and took in her new domain. The smell hit her first, a suffocating stench of raw leather, dried blood, rancid bear fat, and unwashed man. The cabin consisted of a single, large room. Animal traps and rusty chains hung from the ceiling rafters. The floor was packed dirt, littered with wood shavings and animal bones. In the corner sat a narrow cot, covered in a filthy wolf pelt. To the right was a stone hearth, choked with a foot of gray ash, and a rusted cast-iron skillet caked in black grease. "Kitchen's there," Stephen said gruffly, dropping the flour sack onto a crude wooden table that had knife gouges all over it. "Don't touch my rifles. Don't touch my traps. Water's out back at the pump. It needs priming." He walked to the corner, picked up a heavy buffalo robe, and threw it at her feet. It kicked up a cloud of dust. "I sleep in the bed," Stephen said, stripping off his heavy wool shirt, revealing a torso crisscrossed with thick, jagged white scars. "You can sleep on the floor near the fire. If it's too hard for you, the barn is out back with the mule." He expected her to cry. The other women had cried at the state of the cabin. They had demanded a proper bed, a clean kitchen, a semblance of civilization. Carmen looked at the filthy floor. She looked at the blood-stained walls. Her entire body screamed in agony from the climb. Her knee was throbbing, and she was so exhausted she could barely hold her eyes open. But as she looked around the miserable, chaotic shack, something shifted inside her. This wasn't just a dirty cabin. This was a fortress of isolation. Stephen Boone lived in this filth intentionally. He created an environment so repulsive, so hostile, that no one would ever want to stay. The cruelty, the impossible hike, the terrible conditions, it was all a defense mechanism. Carmen slowly bent down and picked up the heavy buffalo robe. "The floor will do fine, Mr. Boone," Carmen said quietly. She walked over to the hearth. Without asking for permission, she grabbed an iron shovel leaning against the stones and began scooping the mountain of cold ash into an empty wooden bucket. Stephen stopped halfway to his cot, turning to frown at her. "What are you doing?" "I am cleaning the hearth, Mr. Boone," Carmen replied, not looking up as her thick arms worked the heavy shovel. "A fire needs to breathe to keep a room warm. And tomorrow, you are going to help me boil lye. This cabin smells like a slaughterhouse." For the first time since Carmen had stepped off the stagecoach, Stephen Boone looked genuinely caught off guard. He opened his mouth to snap at her, but Carmen had already turned her back to him, methodically clearing away the filth of his solitude. As she dug deeper into the ash, her shovel struck something hard. She paused, scraping away the soot with her fingers. Buried deep in the forgotten debris of the fireplace was a small, partially melted tin box. The clasp was broken. Carmen glanced over her shoulder. Stephen was lying on his cot, his back turned to her, feigning sleep. Carefully, Carmen pried the tin open. Inside, untouched by the flames, was a faded tintype photograph of a beautiful, frail woman holding a smiling baby girl and a child's woolen mitten stained with something dark and dried. Carmen stared at the items, the pieces of a tragic puzzle suddenly falling into place. The mountain man didn't hate women. He was terrified of losing another one. Carmen closed the tin and quietly slipped it into her deep apron pocket. She looked at the giant of a man sleeping across the room. He had tried to break her body today. Tomorrow, she decided, she was going to start dismantling his walls. Down in the valley, the men of Blackwood Creek gathered daily at Elias Harper's general store. The chalkboard behind the counter remained untouched. Day 3 passed, then day 4. By day 6, preacher Thomas Miller publicly declared that Stephen Boone had surely murdered the poor, heavy-set woman and buried her out behind the outhouse. Nobody was willing to hike up Broken Ridge to find out. Up on the mountain, a different kind of survival was taking place. It was a silent, grinding war of attrition. Carmen woke on her second morning with muscles so stiff she had to physically roll herself toward the hearth just to gain the momentum to stand. Her knee was swollen to the size of a melon, turning a deep, angry violet. But as Stephen snored in his pelt-covered bed, Carmen limped to the yard, pumped 2 heavy iron buckets of water, and began to boil lye soap. For the next 4 days, Carmen worked with a relentless, punishing fervor. She possessed a physical mass that most saw as a hindrance, but she knew how to use it as leverage. She put her entire weight behind the wire brush, scrubbing the packed dirt floor until the layers of grease and bone fragments were scraped away. She washed the windows, letting the harsh mountain sunlight pierce the gloom of the cabin for the first time in a decade. Stephen watched her in brooding silence. He was a man accustomed to the brutal mechanics of the wild, and he recognized endurance when he saw it. Yet, his stubbornness was legendary. If the grueling labor and the squalor wouldn't drive her away, he decided to escalate the psychological warfare. On the afternoon of her 5th day, Carmen was outside pinning washed linens to a rope line when Stephen emerged from the tree line. He was dragging a massive, freshly killed elk by the antlers. Blood trailed heavily through the dirt. Without a word, he hoisted the carcass onto the front porch, the dead eyes of the beast staring blankly at the front door. He tossed a rusted, dull skinning knife onto the floorboards at Carmen's feet. "I'm heading out to check the upper ridge traps," Stephen grunted, picking up his Winchester rifle. "Governor Benjamin Potts just passed a new territorial tax on pelts down in Helena. Means I gotta work twice as hard to buy coffee. You want to eat this winter, Chicago? Have it butchered, salted, and hung in the smokehouse by sundown." He turned on his heel and disappeared into the dense pines, expecting to return to a weeping woman and a rotting carcass. Carmen stared at the mountain of meat, fur, and blood. Her stomach heaved. In the Chicago textile mills, she had worked with fine silks and delicate cottons. The metallic smell of fresh death was overwhelming. She looked down at the rusted blade, then up at the unforgiving peaks. "He wants me to break," she thought, the familiar spark of defiance igniting in her chest. "He wants me to look at this mess and see myself unwanted, messy, incapable." She tied a canvas apron tightly around her thick waist, rolled up her sleeves past her dimpled elbows, and picked up the knife. She spent the first hour sharpening the blade on a wet stone until it sang. Then she went to work. It was grotesque, exhausting labor. Her arms ached, her apron became soaked in dark crimson, and her face was smeared with sweat and grease. But Carmen was meticulous. She remembered the butchers back in the city slums, how they wasted nothing, separating the haunches, trimming the fat for tallow, stringing the tough meat for jerky. When Stephen returned, just as the sun was dipping below the horizon, he stopped dead in his tracks. The porch was scrubbed clean of blood. The elk was gone. He pushed open the cabin door. The scent of roasted garlic, wild onions, and seared venison filled the air, a stark contrast to the usual smell of rancid fat. Carmen was sitting at the table, her hands blistered and bandaged with clean cotton strips. The elk had been expertly butchered, the cuts wrapped in waxed paper and stacked in the cold box. The haunches hung perfectly in the small smokehouse out back. Stephen lowered his rifle. For a long moment, the mountain man simply stared at the massive woman sitting in his kitchen. "Knife was dull," Carmen said flatly, not looking up from the shirt she was mending. "I sharpened it. Dinner is on the stove. Wash your hands before you sit, Mr. Boone." Stephen didn't argue. He walked to the wash basin, the silence in the cabin suddenly shifting. It was no longer the silence of a predator waiting for its prey to die. It was the bewildered silence of a man who realized his fortress walls had just been breached. By the third week of September, the air on Broken Ridge turned brittle and sharp. The vibrant greens of summer bled into violent golds and reds, signaling the rapid approach of a Montana winter. Despite the changing seasons, an unspoken, fragile truce had settled over the cabin. Stephen still spoke in grunts and short commands, and Carmen still slept on the heavy buffalo robe near the hearth. But the cabin was warm. The floor was clean. Stephen found his torn wool shirts mended with impeccable tiny stitches. Carmen, in turn, found that her water buckets were mysteriously filled every morning before she woke, and a pair of sturdy, custom-made leather boots had been quietly left at the foot of her pallet. Neither acknowledged the shifting tides. They were two broken people, orbiting each other in a clean, quiet purgatory. Then, the mountain decided to intervene. It happened on a Tuesday. Stephen had ventured to the northern ridge to repair a series of snare lines. The sky, which had been a clear, piercing blue at dawn, suddenly bruised into a violent, churning purple by mid-afternoon. The temperature plummeted 20 degrees in an hour. An early squall, a freak, localized blizzard sweeping off the Bitterroot Peaks, slammed into the mountain. Inside the cabin, Carmen watched the snow begin to fall, horizontal and blindingly fast. By 4 o'clock, the wind was howling like a wounded animal down the stone chimney. By 6 o'clock, the snow was a foot deep against the door. Stephen was not home. Panic, cold and sharp, seized Carmen's chest. A man caught in a whiteout on the ridge wouldn't last the night. The temperature was dropping too fast. She bundled herself in every layer of wool she could find, wrapped a heavy woolen scarf around her face, grabbed a coiled rope and a kerosene lantern, and shoved the cabin door open against the mounting snowdrift. The wind nearly knocked her off her feet. The cold was a physical blow, stealing the breath from her lungs. But Carmen pushed forward, using her massive weight to anchor herself against the gale, plunging into the blinding white. She followed the trail she knew he took, screaming his name into the roaring wind. "Stephen! Stephen!" She found him nearly a mile up the trail, and the sight stopped her heart. A widowmaker, a massive, rotting pine branch snapped by the violent wind, had crashed down onto the trail. Stephen lay beneath it. The trunk, thick as a whiskey barrel, was pinning his right leg to the frozen earth. He was semi-conscious, his face pale as paper, his beard crusted in ice. He had tried to dig himself out, his hands bloody and raw, but the wood was too heavy. Carmen dropped to her knees beside him. "Stephen!" His eyes fluttered open. He looked at her, his vision swimming. "Go back," he rasped, his voice barely audible over the wind. "Too cold. You'll freeze. Leave me." "Shut up," Carmen roared, her deep voice cutting through the storm. She assessed the situation. The branch was easily 600 pounds of dead, waterlogged wood. Stephen couldn't move it. A normal woman couldn't move it. But Carmen was not a normal woman. She looked at a sturdy, low-hanging branch on a neighboring oak tree. She took the thick hemp rope she had brought, tying one end securely around the widowmaker pinning Stephen. She threw the other end over the sturdy oak branch, creating a crude pulley system. She grabbed the loose end of the rope. She didn't have the upper body strength to pull the log off him with her arms alone. She had to use the one thing the world had always told her was a curse: her mass. Carmen wrapped the thick rope around her waist and tied it off. She turned her back to the log, dug the heavy heels of her new leather boots into the freezing mud and snow, and threw her entire 300-pound frame forward. The rope snapped taut, groaning in protest. The oak branch creaked. Carmen screamed, a primal sound of pure, unadulterated exertion, her thick legs straining, her massive shoulders leaning into the harness. Slowly, agonizingly, the widowmaker shifted. It lifted 1 inch, then 2. "Pull your leg out!" Carmen screamed, her face purple, her lungs burning as if she inhaled glass. Stephen, groaning in agony, used his bleeding hands to drag his crushed leg out from under the timber. The second he was clear, Carmen released the tension. The massive log slammed back into the dirt, shaking the ground. Carmen collapsed into the snow, gasping for air. But the ordeal wasn't over. Stephen couldn't walk. The femur was cracked, perhaps broken, and the blizzard was intensifying. Carmen dragged him to his feet, pulling his left arm over her wide, sturdy shoulders. She essentially carried the giant mountain man, her immense frame acting as a crutch, a shield against the wind, and an engine of sheer willpower. The mile back to the cabin took 2 hours. When they finally crashed through the front door, they collapsed onto the floorboards in a tangle of snow and exhaustion. Carmen didn't rest. She dragged Stephen to the cot. She cut away his frozen buckskin trousers, revealing a deeply bruised, mangled leg. She set the bone with a sickening crack that made Stephen pass out from the pain, splinted it with kindling wood, and packed the skin with a foul-smelling poultice of crushed pine needles and whiskey. For 3 days, the blizzard raged outside. For 3 days, a violent fever raged inside Stephen. He thrashed on the cot, soaked in sweat, his mind trapped in the past. Carmen sat beside him, wiping his forehead with a damp cloth, forcing drops of water down his throat. In his delirium, the hardened mountain man wept. "Mary," he sobbed, his large hands grasping at the empty air. "Mary, the snow. It's too deep. I couldn't dig her out. Little Sarah. The fever. I couldn't save them. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry." Carmen sat in the dim light of the cabin, the wind screaming outside, and listened to the shattered heart of Stephen Boone spill onto the floor. He hadn't brought her to the mountain to torture her. He brought her here because he believed he was cursed, and he wanted to drive her away before the mountain could kill her too. On the morning of the 4th day, the wind died. The morning sun pierced the frosty windows. Stephen opened his eyes. The fever had broken. He felt weak, hollowed out, but the agonizing fire in his blood was gone. He turned his head. Carmen was asleep in a wooden chair beside his bed. She looked exhausted, her face pale, dark circles bruised under her eyes. Stephen shifted, groaning as his splinted leg throbbed. The noise woke Carmen. She blinked, sitting up straight, her eyes immediately darting to his face. The fever broke. she said quietly, her deep voice a soothing rumble in the quiet cabin. Stephen looked at his leg, expertly splinted. He looked at the fire, roaring warmly in the hearth. Then he looked at Carmen. He remembered the storm. He remembered the impossible weight of the tree lifting off him. He remembered the warmth of her massive body shielding him from the wind. "You stayed," he whispered, his voice cracking. "Why?" Carmen reached into her deep apron pocket. She pulled out the small, melted tin box she had found in the ashes weeks ago. She placed it gently on his chest. "Because a broken man needs an anchor, Stephen," Carmen said softly, meeting his flinty eyes without flinching. "And God knows I am heavy enough to hold us both down." Winter on Broken Ridge was a brutal, isolating force that usually drove men mad. But inside the soot-stained walls of Stephen Boone's cabin, the relentless blizzards of 1882 forged an unbreakable alliance. For months, the mountain remained impassable. As Stephen's legs slowly knit back together, Carmen became the sole provider. She checked the snare lines near the tree line, hauling back frozen hares and ptarmigans. She chopped the firewood, her thick arms swinging the heavy iron axe with a rhythmic, steady power that fascinated the bedridden mountain man. In the evenings, by the glow of the grease lamp, Stephen taught her how to clean, oil, and load his Winchester repeating rifle, guiding her blistered fingers with his own scarred hands. The silence between them shifted from a battleground to a sanctuary. Stephen stopped seeing her sheer size as a stubborn defiance and began to recognize it as the very foundation of her survival and his own. He watched the way the firelight caught the deep, rich brown of her eyes, and how her heavy, booming laugh could completely banish the ghosts of his past that haunted the cabin's corners. Carmen, in turn, saw past the terrifying, grisly-scarred exterior of the mountain man, finding a fiercely loyal protector whose heart had simply been buried under too much grief. But the real world, driven by greed and opportunism, had not forgotten them. By late April of 1883, the unforgiving ice began to fracture. The spring thaw turned the 5-mile trail down to Blackwood Creek into a treacherous river of mud. Down in the valley, the town had long since concluded the obvious. Stephen Boone and his massive bride had perished in the freak September blizzard. Preacher Thomas Miller had even said a brief, solemn prayer for their frozen souls. However, their presumed demise presented an incredibly lucrative opportunity. A month prior, agents working for William Andrews Clark, the ruthless Montana Copper King, who was rapidly buying up the territory around Butte, had quietly run a geological survey on the lower slopes of the Bitterroots. They discovered that Broken Ridge sat directly atop a massive, untapped vein of copper ore. With Boone dead, the land was considered abandoned territory, ripe for a legal claim jump. On the first Tuesday of May, as the alpine wildflowers began to push through the melting snow, the violent reality of the valley came knocking. Carmen was out by the smokehouse, rendering bear fat into tallow, when she heard the heavy, sucking sound of hooves in the mud. She wiped her hands on her apron and stepped into the yard. 3 men rode into the clearing. They were not trappers. They wore dark wool suits dusted with trail dirt, bowler hats, and carried repeating rifles resting casually across their saddle horns. The man in the center, Josiah Flint, a notorious land assayer and enforcer for Clark's syndicate, pulled his chestnut mare to a halt. He stared at Carmen, his eyes widening in genuine shock beneath his brim. He had expected to find a ruined, empty cabin, and perhaps a few sun-bleached bones. He certainly did not expect to find a 300-pound woman boiling fat in the front yard. "Well, I'll be damned," Flint spat, adjusting his coat. "The agency didn't lie. You're a big one, ain't you? Where's the giant?" "Mr. Boone is not taking visitors," Carmen said. Her voice was calm, deep, and steady. She did not take a step backward. Flint chuckled, a dry, rattling sound. "I reckon he ain't. A widowmaker tree crushed him back in September. Word in town is you starved to death up here. It's a miracle you're breathing, lady, but your luck just ran out. This land is being requisitioned by the Clark Syndicate for mining development. You have 10 minutes to pack whatever fits in that carpet bag and start walking." "This land belongs to Stephen Boone," Carmen stated, her fists clenching at her sides. "And I am his lawful wife." "He's dead, and you're a squatter," Flint snarled, his patience evaporating. He nodded to the two armed thugs flanking him. "Burn the barn first. If the fat cow won't move, we'll smoke her out of the valley." The man on the right spurred his horse forward, pulling a sulfur match from his vest. He didn't make it 3 feet. The deafening crack of a Winchester rifle echoed off the canyon walls. The bullet neatly severed the leather reins in the thug's left hand, missing his fingers by a fraction of an inch. His horse reared violently, nearly throwing him into the mud. Flint whipped his head toward the cabin. Standing in the doorway, leaning heavily on a carved hickory cane, was Stephen Boone. He looked thinner, his face weathered and gaunt, but the terrifying, predatory fire in his flint-colored eyes burned brighter than ever. He racked the lever of the Winchester, chambering another round with a sharp, metallic clatter. "The barn is full of dry hay, Flint," Stephen rumbled, his voice carrying effortlessly across the clearing. "I'd hate to see it catch fire. Almost as much as I'd hate to put a .44 caliber slug through your sternum." Flint's face drained of color. "Boone, you're supposed to be in the ground." "My wife dug me out," Stephen said, stepping onto the porch. He didn't look at the armed men. He looked at Carmen, a profound, unshakable pride radiating from him. "Now, you are trespassing on her front yard. Turn your horses around. If I see a Clark Syndicate man on Broken Ridge again, I won't aim for the reins." Outgunned and entirely unnerved by the ghost of the mountain man, Flint and his thugs silently wheeled their horses around and spurred them back down the treacherous, muddy trail. An hour later, Stephen and Carmen made the descent themselves. Stephen rode the mule, his stiff leg resting against the saddle, while Carmen walked proudly beside him, the heavy mud no match for her custom leather boots. When they finally broke through the tree line and entered the muddy main street of Blackwood Creek, the town stopped. The blacksmith dropped his hammer. The saloon pianist ceased playing mid-note. Elias Harper stood frozen behind the counter of the general store, watching through the glass as the dead mountain man and the bride they had bet against marched right up to his door. Stephen dismounted with Carmen's help. He limped into the general store, the crowd parting like the Red Sea. He slammed a heavy canvas sack onto the counter. It hit the wood with a heavy thud, spilling out a dozen prime, flawless silver fox and winter wolf pelts. "Provisions, Elias," Stephen commanded. "Flour, sugar, coffee, and a spool of red silk ribbon for my wife." Elias Harper swallowed hard, his eyes darting to Carmen, who stood massive, clean, and unyielding beside the terrifying trapper. "Yes, Stephen. Right away." Stephen turned his gaze to the wall behind Elias. The chalkboard was still there, covered in faded chalk tally marks, betting on the exact day Carmen would flee or die. Stephen reached over the counter, took a wet rag from a bucket, and methodically wiped the slate completely clean. He turned to the stunned crowd gathering at the door. He found Preacher Thomas Miller in the front row, clutching his Bible. "Preacher," Stephen said, extending his thick, scarred hand to Carmen, who took it firmly. "The agency paper was legal, but it ain't enough. We need a proper ceremony, today, and if anyone has a single objection to the woman who conquered Broken Ridge, they can take it up with my Winchester." Nobody objected. Under the bright Montana sun, Carmen Higgins did not just survive the untamable mountain man. She became the immovable mountain itself, grounding him, saving him, and claiming a wild, beautiful corner of the world as her own. The town of Blackwood Creek never placed a bet against her again. If Carmen and Stephen's incredible journey of survival and love on Broken Ridge kept you on the edge of your seat, hit that like button. Don't forget to share this video with fellow fans of gritty, true-to-life Western romance. Subscribe to our channel and ring the bell so you never miss another thrilling frontier story. Leave a comment below. Would you have survived the winter on Broken Ridge?